Humber Bay basically it's like it's divided into three sections. The first, of course, is the waterfront. And that would be an area that really has been used primarily for recreation and residential. Then there's a triangle bound by Lakeshore Boulevard, Park Lawn, and the Queensway. Then north of the Queensway would be the third section. It was mostly farmland to begin with, gradually developing into market gardening with small farms. And that's the area that grew into the residential section. And that's where you would find stores, you would find schools and churches to serve the community.
When my grandfather came from England, it was allotted, they called it a section of ground. Well, that was Park Lawn Cemetery now. That was my grandfather's market garden. So even up until in the late 50s, my Uncle Joe owned 15 acres on Park Lawn. My Uncle George owned 15 acres on Prince Edward. And my Uncle Randolph, he owned, I think it was 30 acres on Park Lawn. And he divided it up into sections for all his family, see? And they had it right up until, I guess, right up until the late 50s. I was born in Humber Bay in 1927, and I had 7 sisters and 5 brothers. I was the second youngest of 13 kids. The taxes on the house then was $12 a year. But if you look at that picture, there's no hydro wires. There was no hydro, there was no sewerage, there was no nothing. And my mom was born in a log cabin on the Queensway in 1884, and she was the second youngest of 23 kids.
My father was Hans Sahau. He immigrated to Canada in 1928, and my mother, who was Anna, came later in that same year. They were married here in Canada, and father started his boat building business right away. And then later in the late 40s, it was my mother Anna who was really interested in getting into the restaurant business, and from there we developed the Dutch Sisters Inn.
I come to Humber Bay in, I believe it was the fall of 1941, and I would be 12 years of age then. And we moved into a house on Winneska Avenue, just in behind the 2 stores.
The name of the school was Humber Bay School. It was on High Street. That used to be Frederica. But there was 2 schools, the old school and the new school. And the old school was one my mother went to, and the other one was built in about 1923. And they're both gone now. They tore both the schools down.
Humber Bay looked completely different than it does today. Before anybody was actually living there, think of the whole waterfront was all beach. And then there was a rise of land behind the beach. And people used to come from locally and from farther away just to go swimming on the beach and to lie in the sun and have picnics. The area up above the beach was called the Lawn, unofficially, and people would have picnics there and family gatherings.
And then there was, on the lake shore was Brooker's Barbecue, Crow's Beach. Brooker's had a beach there too. Yeah, we used to swim there quite often. You know, it was right opposite, where it was opposite now is gone. But where the Palace Pier was, it was just west of that.
Devon's Boathouse was on the west side of the Humber River between the lake shore and the CN rail. And that had actually been where Octavius Hicks' first boathouse had been. So on both sides of the river, though, there were a lot of boathouses. And the main purpose there was to rent canoes or rowboats for people who had come to enjoy the recreational aspects of the area. Now the Brown Derby, and there was another place called the National Sporting Club. They were gambling joints in Humber Bay. The National Sporting Club was started by Abe Orpin, who was a well-known figure in Toronto. The Brown Derby was started in about 1930s and was managed by a man with a criminal record named Manny Feder. And both of them maintained that they were just clubs for people to have fun and enjoy sports and so on, but they were raided a few times and people were charged with being found-ins, and the owners were charged with running a common gaming house. The location of Humber Bay was picked because it was close enough to Toronto that they could get there, but it wasn't so close that there was a major police presence. Because in 1934, it's hard to believe, but the police force for Etobicoke only had 8 constables and 2 vehicles to serve all of Etobicoke from Steeles Avenue down to Lake Ontario.
In the late 1920s, an idea came about to build a pier in Humber Bay. It was to be named after Palace Pier in Brighton, England, and was meant to include a ballroom, roller rink, a bandstand, theater, and a boardwalk. The cornerstone was laid in 1931, but due to the Depression, the plan was amended. Instead of stretching 550 meters into the lake, the architectural firm of Craig and Medill revised the design to reach a mere 80 meters with only one building. The Palace Pier was vacant for most of the 30s due to the Depression and the start of the Second World War. Finally opening in 1941, it hosted a variety of events over the next 20 years, including big bands, dancing, and it even operated as a roller rink.
All of the large big bands performed there, people like Duke Ellington, Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey, Les Brown and his band of renown.
Well, I found out about the Palace Pier, and I believe it was because of Eddie Harrison and his sister Dorothy Harrison. Their mother worked at the Palace Pier in the cloakroom. So they got me to go down, and they were doing roller skating there. So I went down there, and Eddie and I got the job of being the skate boys and then sitting on the little boxes. And as you know, the war was on then, and the men would come in with these big army boots, and we'd have to strap the roller skates onto them. And then later on, the next year, I guess it was, I got a job also down there of doing the parking for the big bands like Bert and Iosi, all them. Anyway, I would park the cars, and then after they were in there, I would go inside, and as you know, they didn't have a liquor license then, and everybody brought their own, but we would sell them pop. And my job then was to walk all around inside picking up the empty pop bottles.
Every week during the summer there used to be name bands, and then they turned it over to roller skating. We used to roller skate there all the time. But let's see, there was Lionel Hampton, Tex Beneke. There was all kinds of name bands, and they drew a big crowd because all these guys were, from Hollywood and down that way, and it was quite a treat to come and dance with, in front of their orchestra.
Sadly, though, in 1963, there was a fire in January started by an arsonist, and there was $500,000 damage done, which was too much, and it was demolished. There is one pier from the Palace Pier that still exists, and it's mounted on the Waterfront Trail with a bit of information about the Palace Pier. And that was donated to the city by the Palace Pier condominium owners. The Juanita Tea Room was established in 1911 by the Cornish family, and it was north of Lakeshore. There are a lot of stories about the Juanita Tea Room because it existed all through Prohibition, and there were always rumors about what was going on there, and they were accused of serving what was called squirrel liquor. When it was called that because it was not good quality, it was made illegally, and it made you go squirrely and want to climb trees. When the Juanita Tea Room, it eventually became a boathouse, and it was owned by Octavius Hicks' son, John, for many years until the 1950s. And then it was bought by the yacht club.
I joined this yacht club, the Toronto Humber Yacht Club on the river here, in 1970. But as a teenager, I used to come up here to the old Hicks's boathouse, and I would bring my canoe up. We would paddle up here of a Sunday afternoon, the girlfriend and I, and go in there and have a pop or a chocolate bar, and that's all they sold was just chocolate bars and pop. And then we would paddle up and down.